I'd like to welcome everybody. This segment is the video technology and transformation of tomorrow's courthouses. We have a wonderful, diverse staff. We have two people who are joining us or will join us over the internet on video. On our team, we have Joseph Beccaria, Jay Farbstein, John Grecian, Emma Rowden, Ann Wallace, and Jennifer Willard. And without further ado, I'd like to get started.
Our introduction is going to be given by Jay Farbstein, who's joining us over GoToMeeting on the internet. Jay, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to our panel on video technology and the transformation of tomorrow's courthouse. It's no coincidence, excuse me. It's no coincidence that there are many initiatives around the implementation and study of video and other technologies in the courts. It's happening, and it's not always happening well or smoothly. So we assembled this panel to bring some of the latest thinking and research to NACM in the hope that we can generate discussion and dialogue to help move the process forward and to give court managers a better idea of what they need to do and what they need to know in order to effectively manage these technologies and procedures. As you can see, we are, I want to say attempting, where we're actually using remote video, and we will ask you later who in the audience is using these kinds of technologies in the courthouse. Just to give you a slightly more detailed introduction to our panel, I am an architect in private practice focusing on planning for justice facilities, mainly courts, and I also am the leader of the American Institute of Architects Justice Architecture Group's research initiative, and in addition a member of the task force that will be described in a moment, developing standards and guidelines for AV and IT infrastructure in the courts. Jennifer Willard is the supervising audio-video systems technical analyst at the California Administrative Office for the courts. As you know, they have, although in somewhat a suspended state, have a program of building on the order of 50 new courthouses, and Jennifer is responsible for developing standards and the actual planning and implementation of these technologies in the courts. Joe Bocchiaro is the Vice President of Infocom, which is the industry professional and technical group relating to audio-video technologies. And as you can see, he probably has the most initials after his name of anyone any of us has ever had the pleasure to meet. He's trained as an engineer and knows a great deal about these technologies. Ann Wallace, Dr. Ann Wallace, is a professor at the University of Canberra with background in law and society. Emma Rowden is at the University of Western Sydney in their architecture department and part of their justice research group. Finally, John Grecian, probably well known to many of you in the audience, trained as a lawyer, a former court administrator, now a court management consultant with special interest in court technologies and a role in the technology on, in the summit on technology to increase access to justice in the courts. A few more comments. This is a time of extraordinary change in technology. We weren't able to have this kind of presentation. You couldn't have seen me do this just a few years ago, but also in challenges to the courts. As all of you know, tremendous increases in demands for service at the same time as tremendous fiscal constraints and budget cuts, reduced numbers of staff, all leading to more pressure for efficiency and therefore more reasons to consider the implementation of technologies that may bring efficiencies and hopefully also effective operations to the ports. So the challenges hopefully also equal opportunities. And the question we'll address is how these technologies, especially audio-visual, will fit into this kind of puzzle. I've been doing this for a few years. When I started, technologies were really quite mediocre. The quality of the video, the quality of the sound was very poor. Many courts who tried to implement technologies, for example, for video arraignment, found that they were not adequate and abandoned them, and there were many other kinds of issues. Now, the technology has improved, but as we've had some experience in using it, we've learned that the effective implementation really depends upon an integrated system of which technology is part. The legal and procedural matters, the culture of the court and of the society, of course the technical issues, and also the spatial architectural concomitants all have to be working together in a tuned system that makes the outcome effective. But before our panelists start, I'd like to just give a brief rundown on the kind of range of uses of video technology and particularly initially video conferencing. One reason for using it is to allow the remote involvement of sensitive parties or witnesses. For example, in a juvenile dependency proceeding where the juvenile is a victim of sexual or other abuse and the accused party is in the courtroom, to avoid the discomfort of having them confront each other in the same space, it may be effective to have the victim appear remotely in the courtroom. This can also work for disruptive defendants. Then there are the possibilities for remote involvement of participants to avoid travel costs. This might be a judge or an expert witness. Emma Rowden, who's not appearing on your screen yet, is participating from Sydney. I'm in Los Angeles. I didn't not come because of the travel costs. I came because my doctor suggested I shouldn't travel yesterday, so I didn't. But there are many reasons for people not to travel based on which to be involved in the proceeding. Additionally, remote presence of criminal defendants to avoid transportation costs and security risks associated with transportation is an area that has seen a fair amount of implementation, used for arraignments and various other kinds of proceedings. In addition, we may have the remote communications between attorneys and clients, settlement negotiations, can engage parties in different locations, trial preparation. And then there are other uses for AV that aren't exactly or necessarily video conferencing, which have to do with evidence presentation, staff meetings and training sessions, the recording and public distribution of proceedings, court record, archiving the information, making it available for appeals, and finally there are applications for courthouse management. So here's what we're going to do this afternoon. We're going to have 3 presentations from our panelists. The first one is, I've called it Learning from Research, Lessons from the Australian Courts. They're going to discuss, Anne and Emma are going to discuss their Gateways to Justice project. The second one will be from Jennifer Willard and Joe Bocchiaro, who are going to talk about the Infocom and AIA initiative toward developing new standards and guidelines for AV in the courts. And then finally, John Greason is going to talk about using technology to increase access to justice. Because we have most of an hour and a half, we're going to invite questions and comments after each of the presentations rather than holding them all for the end. And at the end, hopefully we'll have time for more general conversation. So with that, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to turn it back over to Anne and Emma for our first presentation.
Thanks very much, Jay. The first thing you're going to notice is because we're using video link, like there is in a court proceeding, we don't usually get a seamless transition between the in-court and the out-of-court experience, so I need to stand here doing a bit of a filler while we bring our PowerPoint presentation online. My colleague Emma is listening to this from Sydney, but you can't see her as yet. Well, I'm going to hand over to Emma at a couple of points in the presentation, and she's going to talk to those slides. The research that we did was actually part of a multidisciplinary research team put together by my colleague Dr. David Tate at the University of Western Sydney. And what we're basically trying to end up with is some operational and design guidelines to help improve video-mediated communications for justice participants. Two of our industry partners in this research were departments of justice from 2 Australian states, and we're in the process of, we have a draft set of guidelines out for them, their comment at the moment, and I'll be talking to you about some of our recommendations. We also had a prosecution agency, the Australian Federal Police, and a couple of technology companies. What we're really trying to do with this project was bring together a lot of stakeholders. We also had academics from a variety of backgrounds. So I'm one of the 2 lawyers on the projects. We had a couple of architects, psychologists, criminologists, sociologists, and a communications expert. Our basic desire was that we wanted to try and look at the issues from a variety of perspectives. A lot of the research that's been done to date tends to come from one disciplinary perspective. We thought there would be value in the guidelines that we're trying to present in bringing together a number of different viewpoints to bring expertise from those disciplines. So what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon is what we did, what we found out, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about the design and operational guidelines that we're about to recommend to our industry partners. We started off with the premise that this technology is being used, and our task was really to look at how courts could get the best out of video link. And our starting point was that this requires more than a plug-and-play approach. What do I mean by that? Well, Australians are pretty good with technology. You know, you give us a mobile phone, you give us a computer, we plug it in and we start playing around with it. But we tend to assume that the experience that we're getting using that technology is the same as the in-court experience. And we believe that essential to getting the best out of your video link is to recognise that video link participation, or remote participation as we call it, is different. It may be better, it may be worse, but it's different. And we think we started off by a view that the relevant factors that might impact its effectiveness were the legal protocols that surrounded its use, obviously legislation and policy, the technology itself, of course, but also the environment in which that technology operates, both the physical environment and what we might call the social environment, the rituals that are performed in the court, and crucially, training. And often when I go to presentations about video conferencing, what I hear is, you know, well, it'll all be fixed when the technology improves. When we've got those high definition screens in, when we improve the audio, this will improve the problem. Well, if you go away with one message from my presentation this afternoon, I would like it to be that getting the best out of your video conferencing requires more than just improving your technology, and that sometimes you can substantially improve performance even with older technology just by paying some careful attention to some of these other factors. What did we do? I'm not going to go through it was a 3-year research project, so I'm not going to go through our research methodology in detail, but this was industry-based, very practical research. We did an extensive series of site visits to video conferencing sites in courts and sites that courts link from within mainly two Australian jurisdictions who are our industry partners. We did some international studies, visits for comparative purposes. We did interviews. The interviews that we selected were people who had expertise in using video links within courts, both judges, judicial officers, expert witnesses, lawyers, remote court officers, court technology staff, architects, some court administrators and judges associates. So these were people who had experience with the technology. We did quite a number of court observations, we did some experimental work, and we also did some testing of the links ourselves, which was fascinating. I got to play judge on numerous occasions. It almost kind of gave me a taste for it. What did we find out? Well, a current practice in Australian courts, you can really divide the remote spaces from which people appear to the court into two types. There are the formal spaces and informal. Formal spaces are those that are generally controlled by the court. They're purpose-built, a remote witness facility for a vulnerable witness, usually children or victims of sexual assault. Video links from prisons, again, formal spaces that have been created for a particular purpose. Informal spaces are those that are generally outside the immediate control of the court, although of course our legislation provides that the court has control for the purposes of certain legal rules. Formal spaces, these are a few photographs to give you an idea of some of the we do have some slightly more modern technology than this in some of the courts, but we're often looking at kind of clunky, older style facilities. Courts in our country, like yours I suspect at the moment, aren't particularly flush with funds. And these are probably a pretty typical representative set of photographs. Informal spaces. Now at this point, you might wonder what I'm doing in that photograph. I'm sitting in what is a remote witness room at a police forensic facility in the city of Melbourne. This room also doubles as the storage room for their photographic equipment. My colleague David Tate in the bottom corner there is sitting in again a police room that's used as a video link room, but is also used as their meeting room, so he gets to sit in front of a set of stacked chairs. You might just think at the moment about the sort of impression those spaces are creating in your minds as you look at those photographs, and what that impression might do to your assessment of that person, if that's somebody perhaps giving evidence from that space. Two main reasons for remote participation in Australia, I suspect, as in the States from Jay's introduction. Remote for what we would call access, so to bring in people from our country covers some pretty huge distances, witnesses who can't fly, who can't afford to be in court. A number of police agencies are trying to use this technology because it saves time for people away from duties if they can give evidence by video link. Medical witnesses, doctors in particular who are busy, overseas witnesses. Access also applies to the use of this technology for judges. We have judges who will tidy up matters that they've dealt with in regional areas by linking back by video link, perhaps on occasion to do sentencing matters or to do pre-trial conferences. A lot of pre-trial work in regional areas now in Australia is done by video link from major capital cities. Court meetings, a lot are done by video link. Remote for separation recurs to the situation Jay talked about, the vulnerable witness, the child witness, victim of sexual assault, where there's a legislative direction either requiring or presuming that their evidence will be given by video link or CCTV. The reasons, well, I've run through some of these. They can be giving evidence. I should note that Australia, unlike the US, doesn't have a constitutional right of confrontation, so our witnesses, general witnesses, can give evidence by video link if the court has a discretion to allow that. Courts do pay close attention, though, to the adequacy of the link to enable the evidence to be tested. Appearing, so remote defendants, bail links, other types of prison links. Attending, courts have used the video links in Australia to let, for example, a community in a remote part of the country that has an interest in a certain court case attend by video link to be able to watch proceedings that are being conducted in a courtroom in another area. We do have judges who might be linked in by video link. For example, a magistrate in a country area goes off sick. Much easier, rather than adjourning all the cases, to beam a substitute magistrate in from one of the metropolitan areas to help clear the list that morning so that people can have their matters dealt with expeditiously. Lawyers, not so common, but there are occasions, most often in pre-trial matters, where lawyers will participate by video link. And I have mentioned the vulnerable witnesses giving evidence, but also sometimes where family matters where you may have parties who are in conflict, a video link might be ordered as a way of separating warring parties. We found great variety in the types of remote spaces, the environment, the technology, and in the types of people who are using the link. And I guess that got us thinking about, whether different participants might actually have different needs for the way the technology is set up and configured. And we noticed that in courts, often it tends to be operated with pretty standard sort of preset configurations. For obvious reasons, busy court offices, you might be managing 5 video links in a list in the morning that's got, another 30 or 40 matters in it. You don't really want things that are too difficult or too complex. And so the technology, if you like, tends to become locked into positions that are the most commonly used positions. The sort of participation, again, Jace mentioned a lot of these, but we found a similar pattern of use within Australia. So we've got family cases, media being linked by a video link occasionally for, really cases that attract a lot of interest, interpreters, the other categories there that I probably mentioned. Interestingly, we noticed that the court, in a way, is becoming a bit of a hub. This was a prediction Fred Lederer made at a conference that I attended many years ago, that this was the sort of thing we were going to start to see happening with the technology. We found it was happening not just with courts becoming a sort of hub of video links, but prisons as well. The video link, once the link's in, people start to think of other ways it might be used. So it might be used to bring other services into the prison, or perhaps to do prison-to-prison type links. Quite a bit of family visitation work, visits between prisoners and their children appears to be happening by video link in some of our prisons, for example. Okay, what we got thinking about this is that what we were really seeing was a move from what we called the discrete to the distributed court. So traditionally our notion is that the court sits in one location. But what's happening with the use of video links is that we are now seeing a shift, to this space that is outside the court, a distributed court. And we were interested in exploring what the implications of this were for the dynamics of the court performance. One of the things we noticed, for example, on the links were difficulties in making eye contact. Problems with the way, often the problems were just with the way the technology was set up and configured. But I guess even when you configured it perfectly, there's still a barrier to getting perfect eye contact, we found. This is one of the, I suppose, most extreme examples we found, where you can see my colleague Emma standing in the courtroom where the lawyer would stand, and the court officer playing the role of the witness on the screen. That witness thinks that they are looking at Emma. They think that they are looking at the lawyer asking them questions. But unfortunately, because of the way the screens and cameras have been misconfigured, they appear to be looking away. And this was a real example that we found that had actually been operating in practice. The court corrected this after we pointed it out to them. But it was an example, of how things can go wrong. The remote space, we believe you can look at it from two perspectives. There's what the court sees and what the remote participant sees. Looking firstly at the experience of what the courtroom sees. What does the courtroom see of the space from which the remote participant appears from? Now it's at this point that I'd like to hand over to Emma, who's going to talk to you through this next section.
Hi there. Can you see me?
Almost. Okay, I'm going to give you the floor.
Okay. Sick.
But we don't see her yet.
So you'll take control of the
There
presentation.
she is.
Okay. Is
Good.
the screen up? Great. Okay. Hi there. This is a bit of a strange experience. I'm sitting here in my office space, which, as you can see from behind me, is in a bit of a messy state. But I deliberately chose the messiest part of my room to illustrate a point. And you can see here that on the left-hand side of the slides here that we've shown a witness appearing from two different backgrounds. On the top left hand is the background we discussed earlier of the stacked chairs, and the background below is in front of a bookcase. And it's really to illustrate this point about, the ways in which people are judged within the context in which they're appearing, and also it may have an effect on how that person feels. We had interviewees, expert witnesses that we spoke to that was sometimes appearing from a room with boxes stacked around them, and it had an impression on them as to how they felt about their own performance. Some of these effects can be about what's in the room, but it can also be about the lighting. So you can see here at the moment I have well, you can't see because it's off screen, but I have a little lamp that's sitting on my desk. Now if I turn it off, this actually has an effect on how much detail you can see of my face. We saw this kind of thing happening on some prison links that we witnessed in our fieldwork. You can see the picture on the right-hand side of the screen is a sketch of the defendant sitting, and they're framed in a way that potentially has an impact on how they're being viewed. They're on the bottom half of the screen. The size of their face is smaller than it would be in life, and you can see people behind in the shot peering in. And this is actually a sketch of something we witnessed during our field observations. Okay, so I think I'll hand over back to you now, Anne.
Thanks, Emma. We're having trouble seeing your face at all now since you turned off that light, so when we come back you might turn it back on. So imagine, I just invite you to think about the impression that you got of Emma just then, sitting in her slightly darkened room against that sort of slightly messy background. If I was bringing her into court as an expert witness, what sort of background, how would I want her to present herself to the court? Okay, what the courtroom also sees, and how aware is the witness of that? Now, people who know me know that I do a lot of gesturing with my hands. If I'm appearing by video link, and unbeknown to me, the court is getting a truncated view of me that doesn't include my hand gestures, how much of what I say is going to get missed because they don't get that non-verbal communication? Often these systems do have a capacity for what's called a self-view, so that the person appearing remotely can get a sense of themselves on how they're going to appear to the courtroom. We found, though, in our inspections that this facility was often not used or turned off. Sometimes because people said they found it distracting during the link, but they didn't realise they could check their appearance beforehand and then turn it off. Documents and exhibits. This was a big problem we found. We know that tools such as document cameras are available and can be used for these purposes, but there were often technical difficulties. Sometimes the systems didn't have sufficient codecs, for example, to enable the exhibit or document to be displayed at the same time as the picture of the witness. So you had this kind of odd experience of the witness talking to a document, but the court not being able to see the witness, or a document being shown to a defendant at the end, but the defendant couldn't see the lawyer or the judge. We found that where these tools like document cameras were available, they often, because they weren't used as often as other things, people would lack familiarity with them. They might be put away in a cupboard because they weren't used very often, and then they couldn't be found again. Often there wasn't sort of IT support readily available at the end where the person was needing to use the document. And so you had the situation, as a couple of our interviewees told us, where, look, I just held it up to the screen, I needed the court to see it. What the remote participant sees of the courtroom. This is the other part of the equation, I guess. And we thought this is important for a couple of reasons. And again, I'm going to ask Emma to talk to you about this.
Okay.
We're talking a little bit here about the sort of cues that an environment provides to people, and I want to be clear that what we're talking about here are, you imagine you come into this room today, you have a look around, you see where people are sitting, you get a sense of this space and how people are behaving in it, and that enables you to adjust your behaviour accordingly. A person coming into a physical courtroom gets those same sort of cues. Bit different when you're on video link. Emma, do you want to take it?
Yeah, so something that we heard often from judicial officers was that they felt that really the remote room is part of the court. That's part of the rhetoric that we heard a lot, and this is reinforced by some of the comments we found. For example, on the Northern Territory Magistrates Court's website, they explicitly state that a room in another building, a remote site, that is connected by means of an audio link or an audio-visual link is part of the courtroom while the link is in operation. Accordingly, the same standards of behaviour apply to persons who are present at the remote site as if they were present at the court building. And I guess what we found is sometimes actually when you went into these remote spaces, they were in decor, in the nature of the room, the finishes, they were very, very different from the environments of a normal courtroom. I mean, often some magistrates' courts rooms are, perhaps a bit more worn down than the court that you see in this picture here. But nevertheless, there are certain features of the space that give you an indication that it's a public arena, that there are certain things expected of you in terms of your behaviour. So what we found coming into these remote spaces is often they gave different kind of behavioural cues in terms of what they said to the participant would be the normal standard of behaviour or normal expectations. So I guess the question we really posed was, when you're seeing this image of a courtroom on your screen, how easy is it to keep in your mind, present in your mind, that you're in court, particularly if for some reason the focus is not on you, there might be discussion in the courtroom. And we had this supported through various things that lawyers and judges and witnesses told us about the kinds of behaviours that might go on. We heard some lawyers talk about remote witnesses joking around, appearing to be not taking it seriously. And if I just move on to the next slide now, we also heard from some lawyers of some defendants, saying things like "see you later" to a judge. So obviously these kinds of conflicting behavioural cues have an impact on the behaviour of people. And we thought that was quite an interesting finding. We had another lawyer saying, I guess that's perhaps an issue, sitting in a remote room does really reduce the formality of the process. So I'll hand that back over to you, Noanne.
Okay. Thanks, Emma. We also had a little bit of interview data about the effect of dealing with people remotely, perhaps on judges. A couple of lawyers we interviewed, in fact, said they thought it was easier for judges to sentence more severely when they were dealing with defendants by video link. Couldn't, on our strength of our data, justify that as an empirical conclusion, but we thought it was interesting. The threshold. When somebody enters into either the space remotely where they're going to give evidence or into the courtroom, it's a different experience. They don't have, as I said, that opportunity to look around, gauge their behaviour, work out what they should do. And in fact, we found it can be a very sudden experience. Somebody can be sitting there and suddenly, without much of a cue, they find they're suddenly being to the court and someone's asking them questions. And the quote here from one of our interviewees was such an experience. This interviewee was a forensic officer waiting to give expert evidence. Suddenly he's psyching himself up, but suddenly, very abruptly, he's live. He said, in fact, he didn't even have time to adjust his tie, and he's starting to give evidence, wondering about, how he's actually presenting himself to the courtroom. And the risk of that, of course, is that people might accidentally expose to themselves things that, they consider, something that, behaviour that they're not wanting the court to see. And we found when we spoke to child witness support officers in particular, they were concerned that the lack of warning about transitions sometimes meant that, personal or casual conversations were exposed to the court, then creating a different impression of the witness. So our message overall is that, yes, we all want the latest, greatest and best technology, of course. That goes without saying. But really, getting the best out of video conferencing, we need to look at the legal rules. But importantly, also the people, the processes and the environment that support the use of the technology. Our recommendations were structured to look at what happens before the link, what happens in the threshold phase, that entry into the physical space, the entry into the link itself, and of course remembering that, the link might go in and out in the course. A witness giving evidence in a trial might have to, be parked for a while there's a legal argument. They might come back into the courtroom on the video link at a later stage. The actual encounter itself, when the video link is live, and what happens afterwards. And we think that it's important to actually look at all these phases, not just what happens while the link is live. I'm not going to take you through all our recommendations. I'm not going to talk at all about our recommendations with regard to technology. Joe and Jennifer are going to be talking about some technology standards. We've made some recommendations for our industry partners along those lines. All I'd like to say is that what we are trying to set, though, are a set of performative standards. So rather than say, what technology you should have, what we want to see is a benchmark that says what that technology should be able to achieve. How you get there today might be quite different to how you get there in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, because we all know that the rate of technology changes. The recommendations I'm just going to talk you through briefly now are those that relate to the design and the human and the support processes. And I've just circled a few that I'd like to emphasise. So we think there should be some minimum standards adopted for courts in our country, so that the court of, tomorrow's courthouse, when it comes to be built, there will be a set of design guidelines that people can look to about how remote witness facilities should look. We'd also like to see a set of guidelines for judges to consider in their decisions about whether to allow video links from sites that are outside the court's control. We found a lot of judges that we spoke to seemed to feel quite disempowered by the technology. They didn't know who to ask for information or guidance, and they often kind of felt pressured once they'd allowed a video link to continue with it, even when they felt that things weren't quite adequate. So they were having trouble with the audio, perhaps. Perhaps they were a bit unimpressed, as one judge we spoke to was, about the fact that the doctor was giving evidence from what appeared to be a hospital tea room, and there were people apparently going in and out making cups of coffee around them. But there'd been a lot of trouble going in to set up this video link. The doctor was only available for a short period of time. It's a serious assault case, important evidence. You can see the sort of pressures that can be on a judicial officer, in that sort of situation. Having a clear set of guidelines available that the judge can say, no, I'm sorry, that's not good enough, makes it a lot easier for them to make a decision, we believe. We believe the technology and the environment should be designed together. We'd like to see architects and IT and AV people talking to each other a lot more in the design phase. We'd like to see a bit more information given to remote participants about what to expect on the video link, what to bring with them, even, some basic stuff about what to wear and what to expect. And importantly, we think there needs to be more consideration given to tailoring the configuration of video links for each individual participant. And that might just mean creation of more preset positions, but it also might mean skilling up those who operate them in the court, sometimes to be able to make adjustments on the fly, So you get a particularly short or a particularly tall witness. It'd be great if your court officer was able to just take the initiative to zoom in, zoom out. In terms of the threshold experience, we believe it's essential that the remote participant gets some form of greeting or welcome to the court. Now, this doesn't have to be, an effusive, gosh, we're glad you're here today, but an opportunity to be introduced to the court, maybe a quick pan around the courtroom just to see who the other people in the courtroom are and what their roles are, so they get a sense of the court, which you don't get from a remote experience, you do get from a physical one. We believe that the remote space should be designed in a way to convey a sense of dignity and respect towards the remote participant and to the courtroom, that there should be some efforts made when these spaces are designed to harmonise them, so they look, less like an office room at Kinko's and perhaps a bit more congruent with the courtroom. That doesn't, in a space that's only used occasionally, a link to the court, maybe a panel that's just wheeled in behind the witness to create that impression. Presentation standards need to be upheld during the link, and this is about empowering judges. It's about allowing all participants to raise their hand to indicate if the audio they can't hear, if their vision is not adequate, if there are problems. And we'd like to encourage a broad view of what constitutes a failure to the link. A failure is not just when you can't see or hear, but a failure might be when the audio is just not good enough. clear definitions at the end, and some went so people know when it's finished, and a regular process to review the experience of all participants with video links so that design guidelines can be upheld and maintained. That's really all I need to say to you, other than to say that we are working on some design guidelines, and these do include technology, and we'd be very interested to hear something about your own experiences with video links in your court. John, should I invite that now, or would we rather do that at the end?
I would take it now.
Okay.
And ask people their experience with listening to Jay and Emma as part of this presentation. What did you experience?
Anyone had any similar experiences or concerns? Yeah?
Thank you. And we do video conferencing with the prisoners. So we have video arraignments twice a week, and we do a remote from the jail. So they have a little area in the jail where they sit, and we have in the courtroom a big screen TV so that people can come into the courtroom, like maybe family members of the prisoners or whatnot, and sit there and see the screen. And then the judge has like a monitor at her desk, and then I'm sat there with the judge. And it is kind of reminded me when you were talking about the attorney looking at the defendant or something, and they were actually thinking they were looking them in the eye, but they weren't making eye contact. We've had a similar sort of situation where we're looking at the big screen, but actually we need to be looking at the little screen because the judge isn't making eye contact with the defendant. And it's very interesting. I do find that maybe the formality of it does seem to be a little less. They tend to be a little more, I guess, not quite as nervous and that type of thing when they're on video. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. I'm all set. I think I'm mic'd up. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Willard, and as mentioned, I oversee the AV Systems Development and Integration Unit for the California Judicial Branch. So I'm sure, like everyone in this room, we all have very long titles that, like, you know, go on the back of the card. So I would just like to ask and just kind of find out who you all are and in this room. How many technology folks do we have in this room? So no technology folks. Court administrators? Court administrators. All right, fantastic. So from that perspective, you oversee the court, the operations, is that correct? Or who else? So who didn't raise their hand? What do you do, if you mind me asking? Yes? Deputy court administrator? Okay, great. Fantastic. So you do digital court reporting. Wonderful, great. That is actually, in California, that is a very, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it's very controversial, whether or not the courts can actually use digital presentation. So wonderful. So as Jay mentioned, in California, we're undergoing a capital infrastructure upgrade that includes the design and construction of 41 plus courthouses, as well as renovation. If everybody knows, California is currently not so golden in terms of their budget, so we're reassessing that. But the reason that I'm here and the reason that Joe is here as well is we come from the technology perspective of actually how do you manage the courts and how do you using technology within your courthouses to gain efficiencies, how are you using it incorrectly, that it might have impacts that you're not aware of, and how are you moving forward? So Joe, he'll talk to you about what AV is. I'm just going to sort of try to help understand how we got here and where we're at and where we need to sort of look forward to. So historically, the courts have been very slow at adopting technology, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Being cautious, what types of implications. Some of the judicial officers are not as inclined to want to utilize technology. Some still don't even use email. So getting a judicial officer to want to embrace an iPad is not necessarily, I'm sure, for all of you out there, the easiest thing to do sometimes. budget restraints. What are your priorities? Your priorities is actually operating a courthouse. It's not trying to put in this big flat panel display and things like that. So you have a lot of different types of priorities in terms of actually what you need to do. That technology generally, and this isn't just in a court, it falls down by the wayside. So it's not seen necessarily as a priority. Historically, the technology has been unreliable. So when it comes to technology, I'm always, the first thing, if it doesn't work, it's broken. And this equipment is broken, and I'm sure you know from your experiences in different areas, as soon as somebody thinks it's broken, they're never coming back. That first experience, that first use, whatever it is, even if it's a human end user error, it doesn't work. So how you put that in, how you have that very first experience is usually one of the most important things. And then there's political differences and legal implications. So at least there are some times where we've seen a sheriff. A sheriff does not necessarily, it's changed a lot and it continues to change, but it wasn't necessarily in the sheriff's best interest from their perspective for the courts to actually put in video conferencing technology. Because what about their bus drivers? What about the people that work for them? They don't have the skills. They don't necessarily are AV technicians. They don't have the work classification to be able to actually operate this equipment. So from their perspective, if you put in this type of technology, what do my bus drivers do? I mean, having actual planning and sort of transitioning the different parties to be able to embrace this and make sure that they have the skills and the training and capabilities to do that is really critical when you're thinking about how you're actually going to put this in. But we saw a shift in the 1990s. So the rules of law, there are a lot of rules of law. I'd suggest certainly looking into the legislation that you have in your own particular state or where you're from. I thought that it was very interesting that in Australia there is no right to have to see your defendant. Right, so just the different types of laws, and there are laws in every state and every jurisdiction, and it's going to be different around what you can and cannot use video, two-way video and audio for. The court reporters, there are some, you cannot use it in California, you cannot use digital recording in a courtroom that requires a court reporter. That is a legal limitation. You cannot use it. So, and California is one of probably the last ones that actually has that requirement. I've seen, maybe not one of the last, but I've seen a lot of courts that are moving towards using digital recording. But California, you cannot. If your courtroom requires a court reporter, you cannot use digital recording as an alternative. The courts began to see potentials and efficiencies, and then the media and press. Los Angeles County. Every single day, they want to have access to the courts. So these types of changes and these types of things that you're seeing happening have really sort of shifted in the way that we actually do our business in the courts. So, and Judge Ito, everybody remember, and this isn't the best picture, but everybody remember how they used the document camera. Well, Joe has a fabulous story that is, and he says, as soon as the O.J. Simpson trial came to light and it was on TV and everybody saw that they had a document, every single judicial officer wanted to have a document camera. They wanted to have that Elmo, if everybody knows what that Elmo is. As soon as everybody wanted to have that Elmo, and as soon as everybody saw that, then there was this really crazy sort of explosion, and now technology is okay, because Judge Ito used to let the document camera. But what it doesn't show here is that actually if you looked at the courtroom, there's a picture out there, and I couldn't find it. I'd still like to see it, but there's a picture of the actual courtroom, and there are cables everywhere. No offense, but the cables, and there's all these, brought in all of these sort of things, and it's because the design and the infrastructure, understandably so, wasn't at that time what it is today and or what it's going to be in the future. So one of the big things that we do is we're not just sort of thinking about how we're designing courthouses for today. We're trying to think ahead, like, how is this going to change? So we'll put the infrastructure in, and to make sure that in the future, if the law changes and court reporting is allowed, we've got the infrastructure and the capabilities all there so that the court doesn't have to do a major renovation just to make that technology fall easily into their courthouse. And then the Casey Anthony trial in 2010. Florida is one of the most, is anybody from Florida? Oh, fantastic. Do you guys, I mean, you guys have one of the most advanced AV technology systems that I have ever seen in my life. The Sunshine State, you have by law, I think it is, that every single one of your proceedings is streamed live. I think or is it the Ninth Circuit? I don't know. I don't know. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. It's one of the most advanced states when it comes to technology and the way that it's being used in the courthouses. It's very impressive. And this is the Casey Anthony. So you can see, what you can see here is you can see, oh, do I have a? You can see all for the public, all of the monitors, everything that's in there. This was broadcast every day, and they had cameras absolutely throughout this facility, and it was a production. It was like a production, like studio. I mean, I'm sure nobody can actually handle all of that sort of stuff, but there's going to be a high-profile case in your courthouse in some point in time. How are you planning the infrastructure for when that media and press wants to be in the back recording something? Do you have a wall plate there with the cable and conduit up to an empty pathway so that it's easy to get it out of the building instead of having to have the additional security because you have to run the cables and what a lot of existing courthouses do now, and out a window or somehow. How are you going to get it out to that satellite truck that's in the, out in the parking lot? So it brought new challenges. All of those sort of things and all of these changes brought the challenges. It was the early infrastructure. I won't name names. This is one of our courthouses. This is how they're handling AV right now. So, and it's a historic courthouse, so I'll give credit to that. But the new challenges of trying to put technology in, very much to what the lady said before, is that when it was first put in, the end users didn't have the infrastructure in their facility, and they didn't understand how the technology was to be used. So, you know, very much to the point, does this look like a real person to you? Does this look like somebody that's actually standing in a courtroom? Is it reproducing that sort of face-to-face experience that people should be able to expect when they're in courthouses? And then very much the point is that the coordination between the stakeholders. So Jay is an architect. We're on the AVIT built task force environment, and that's Joe's task force. And one of the most important things that we did was we wanted to make sure, and John's on the task force, we have lawyers, we have architects, we have AV consultants, and we have end users. Our colleague from The Hague, I'm always really excited about that. Like, he has to do facial distortion and recognition. Like, we have brought together all of the different stakeholders, because from Jay's perspective, from an architectural perspective, this is a beautiful room. Maybe I don't want to speak for him because Jay, maybe you don't think it's a beautiful room, but from his perspective, this is, architecturally speaking, a really beautiful courthouse. What you would think, dignity, respect, and all of those sort of things. From an AV technology, this makes me cringe, because trying to put speakers in this space, trying to put microphones, the acoustics, everything that you would try to do to reproduce an experience that is defensible is, in that space, doesn't work. Same thing in here, the poor lighting, the types of things like that. So we realize that we do need leadership. We realize that we need to bring together all the different parties when it comes to the capabilities of being able to design and construct a courthouse. And who are those parties? They're the courts, they're the AV end users, and I think I've got that here. They're the architects, the AV consultants, the legal professionals, and then the owner end users. So this is something, I won't go through all of these because I know we're tight on time, but we just established in January of 2012. And that group down there at the bottom, there's less than 10 of us, but what we're trying to do is provide an AIA-sanctioned publication after 1 year that will help the courts, the architects, the engineers, and everybody from your perspective look at this and say, what do I need to do and how do I do it? And why does that matter even? This is a case, and there was an example, if you look up Cook County in Illinois, this is bail fee settings, and it was actually challenged in court. One of the most important things that I could ever stress to anybody putting in AV technology in your courthouse, it has got to be legally defensible. So I think of three things when I design AV technology. And in my industry, it's the three weirdest things that people never think about. I think about, can it be used as a weapon? Can it be vandalized? And then, what is it, John? What's that? The right to reversal? Does it create grounds for reversal? That is probably one of the biggest things, and one of the things to take away from the earlier presentation. All of those different things. Does it create the grounds? And the Sandusky case that came up recently is one of the most important points that I think, most recent points to think about and consider. While their case, they're challenging that the prejudicial information of an NBC interview is the reason that they're trying to get it declared as a mistrial, his conviction. So it's incredibly important. While that's not AV technology, standards that have been adopted around it, your judicial officers are going to tell you, well, I have a 65-inch flat panel in my house. That's fine. It works. No problem. Well, there are actually viewing distances that are based on science and math. So a 65-inch flat panel from a jury looking at it 25 feet away is not okay. It's just a matter of time before some attorney is going to make the case to say, this is a mistrial, I want this to be declared a mistrial because the jury could not have possibly been able to see that actual screen from that far away and the evidence that was displayed on it. So for your perspective,
Jennifer, before we go on, could you talk a little bit more about Cook County and the cause of what this data means
thank you.
Why it is this way and what the federal court did?
Yes, well, I'll let you tell what the federal court did, but I will tell you how we got there. This is actually the bail fees that were set for defendants when they were actually before this on the left side of this line, when they were physically in the court. They installed video equipment for efficiencies, and they installed it in, the jail to try to bring people quicker and make it more. Well, this was the evidence, and this was I am so impressed with this study. So you certainly would look this up to see like what not to do. And also, I was very skeptical. I said, well, okay, so somebody says this is the fees that were set after they put in the video conferencing, and the video links, all this stuff, and it raised. It absolutely went up. So all of the bail fees that were being set for people, as soon as they put in video conferencing and video equipment, it completely went up. And you find, and when they went back and looked at it in the data, it was a poor quality, it was grainy pictures, the change of the proceedings, there was 26 seconds on average, it was 26 seconds that people went through, and it was just sort of disastrous. So tell us about what happened.
Well, the federal court struck it down and said it was a denial of due process. Because the results, the outcomes, were so disparate from the in-courtroom experience versus the video experience.
Yeah, I don't think they have it. They have not gone back to it. Yep. It was challenged. Well, it's not illegal to have video arraignment. In that particular case, it was challenged and struck down that they can't do it. It's not to say that they can't necessarily come back and provide a good quality and recreate an experience which is, what as ideal. Under those circumstances of what they were doing, it is no longer. They're not able.
And you could certainly guarantee that if they reintroduce it, it's going to be under a microscope, and the public defender is going to be prepared to make exactly this argument again.
Perfect. Yeah, please.
That's right.
It definitely has. I would argue that it wasn't even the technology in this particular case that was the problem. It was the way they set it up. It was the fact that they didn't understand the implications of, and I'll get back to the slide in 1 second because we're really out of time and I've got a lot to do. But this is, going back to the very first presentation, this is Cook County. This is the way that they set it up. So from a broadcasting and like when you make movies and when you do things like that, you put a camera high up on to try to make people look small. This girl looks weak. I mean, just looking at the impression that you get from her, the white background, the open door, all of those sort of things, there's nothing wrong with the technology, but the way that this technology is set up gives the person looking at it a particular impression. And that goes back to the very first presentation about where your camera angles are, where the placement is. Whereas this person on the left, this person that's on the left, looks strong. That's just a picture, but look at the colors. That's the color of a courtroom. versus this stark contrast, you don't feel like the person's in the courtroom. You don't, like, even just the color of the paint gives you a different impression between whether or not somebody is capable, able, or they're strong enough to state their case. This girl, look, I mean, you see this right here? That's a video, that's the technology. Somebody typed in, this is the jail. I mean, just like, even just something like that. This young woman was convicted in 2010 of murdering a 23-month-old child. Looking at this picture and the way that it's sort of set up, I don't make that sort of connection between that immediately and initially. Not to say that at that point in time under these proceedings that it was the point that you're supposed to make. But the fact is that you should have just seen this. It should have been straight on in an angle, and it should have been having the colors behind it. So I'm thinking that for the sake of time that I'm just going to turn it over to Joe. What I want to leave you with is one of the most important things. We're working on the design and sort of trying to help fix some of these standards so that people can do it. But regardless, what I find time and time again, if you're going to make the investment, you need to make the investment in your maintenance and service. It's not this capital cost. You can't just buy the equipment, put it in. Time and time again, what happens? You buy the equipment, you put it in, as soon as it breaks, nobody has money to fix it. When you're looking at planning and you're looking at budgeting and you're looking at putting together this entire package, you have to think of the life cycle of the equipment and or the replacement of the equipment and how you're going to service it, how you're going to maintain it, and what's going to happen when it breaks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Jennifer.
You want the mic?
I'll use this. Okay, so I hope you're seeing the pattern here now, right? Of what we're trying to get across is that we don't want to start arriving at decisions about what technology to use unless we did all our homework, which is actually very, very difficult. Fortunately, though, there have been quite a few years now where this technology has been used, and look at some of these incredible lessons, and there's a lot at stake for the individuals who are on the other side of that camera, so we take it very seriously. But from the audiovisual design point of view, there's a real fundamental thing that a lot of people overlook right at the outset, and that is that an audiovisual system isn't just all of the gear and the wires and cables connecting it. True audiovisual design professionals think of the system as really three things. All of that stuff, but really starting with the room and the people in the room. And those three things work in tandem with each other. So when you start to think of it that way and you look at the people in the room, there's a lot going on. And it's actually very difficult to recreate the experience of eyes and ears. They're very, very sophisticated because your brain is making all of these incredible computations all day long that you don't think about. So when you try to duplicate that with a camera, with lights shining at a person's face or listening, it's actually very difficult. So you know about things like eye charts, right? The Snellen eye charts where you're looking at the E's and the numbers. That's the sort of relationship that we think about with physiology of the people in the room to the technology. And that's where the standards are that we're going to talk about really begin, is with that. That's always the most difficult part when we do AV standards, is beginning with that representation. And then we get into the architecture, and it all becomes even more complex, right? Because now whatever is happening in the room with the lighting and the reflections off the walls and different things makes a big difference in the way people look, the way you perceive everything in the room. Same with the acoustics in the room. All of these things working together. So that has to be part of the standards too. And then you get to the technology part. And you start thinking about ergonomics, how people relate to the technology, how they use it, and so forth. So it's very, very complicated. Don't let anybody tell you that it's not. So as we've gone through the years of using this equipment, we've discovered that there are really quite a few places that you need to incorporate it if you want to have the whole system. So now the system isn't just the room It's not just the holding cell or the courtroom. It's both of those things and everything in between. So there are a lot of applications and a lot of different uses, but it all boils down to the same set of rules of what I said before about the physiology of the people. So that might sound like a lot of hooey, but in my career, I worked in a lot of courtrooms, courthouse projects in the federal level. And there was always a question of someone saying, well, something like, how big should the screen be, right? It seems like a real simple question. Well, guess what? There is no standard for that. How loud should it be? What should the acoustics be like so that we have what we call intelligibility, so that you can understand what the people are saying in many, many different languages, because there's different ways of understanding different languages and intelligibility. So some of those simple questions we don't have any standards for until recently. So that's what we're working on, and it applies to all of these different types of rooms. We also have found that there has to be a very strong dialogue, and that's why I'm privileged to be here with you all, because the dialogue is between you and the technology people. We would never get to any of these things unless we sat with a judge, tried to understand what's important to them, try to understand the culture. You're going to find a lot of AV people, they don't understand the culture, and you're looking for them to crawl into it. They have to sponge up what your needs are and spit it back out in terms of a design. It's very, very difficult to do. And you don't know what you need either, because it's new. So the dialogue is, here's the new technology, here's how it works, here's how we can apply it, and it's a very, very creative, iterative process. And you have to have patience with that. And you're going to try things. But there's a lot of research, like I said, out there now for a lot of these different things. The other really serious issue that we started our project with was the idea of incompatibility between different facilities. Incompatibility between, even in a municipality, you can have the inability for one room to talk to another one technically. And that may get better in the future, but right now it's really, there are a lot of different ways of doing that. Then you get into, well, now, what if I want to talk to a state facility or a federal facility? And Jennifer mentioned we have someone from The Hague, from the International Criminal Court. Imagine what they go through talking to different countries and maintaining very, very serious security for the people that are on the other side of that camera, whose personal and families' lives are at stake. So this whole idea of the AV system being a bunch of cameras and so forth, that's the hard part. But the other hard part is now making things compatible. And a lot of it is done in IT now. So more and more you have this partnership between the AV people and the IT people, and the lines are blurring between the two. So you're looking for people that are going to be able to speak both languages and work with your IT people. And now you're going to get a lot of other efficiencies out of this. And there are a lot of interesting things going on. But a couple of the applications were mentioned before. So we're thinking in terms of, here's what you want to do, here's where you're going to do it, and then here's how we're going to do it. And so all of these different kinds of needs that already are being addressed by technology and AV and IT are blurring. They're blurring, they're going on the same networks, and they're getting even more complicated. The society is changing. You have different cultural aspects to it. You have a lot of need for interpretation, simultaneous interpretation and so forth. There are all of these regulations in the healthcare industry with HIPAA. There are regulations with disabled people, with the ADA. And all of these things play into our AV technology. So it's really getting to be very complicated. So I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to say that you need to find partners who can work with you on this to try to get this accomplished. And some of it is very new, but it boils down to an understanding of those fundamental principles of how everything relates. The lighting and so forth, and the displays. And just because some of the technology is getting less expensive and maybe easier to use doesn't mean that you don't have to still go back to the fundamentals. And a lot of times IT people are going to be fantastic in those connectivity issues, but they really will not necessarily be sensitive to the AV issues, to the things that we've been talking about. And that is one of the big problems that we see, and it will propagate if we just allow IT people to continue and not learn all of these other things. The other part of what you need to pay attention to are proprietary, and I don't want to, I'm not here to badmouth any companies, but you got to make sure that you understand if you're buying a system that if it's proprietary, it may save you a lot of money because they've integrated things together nicely for you, but make sure that you are going to be able to use it to talk to these other locations, perhaps, if that's something that you're going to need to do. So in the AV world, we have this department that I run of standards and industry innovations, and we're looking at a lot of these issues. And it's all actually quite new. You would be surprised how new. It's only about 3 or 4 years that we've been trying to create standards in this space. So rest assured that there are a lot of people working on this, and it's part of our job to get the word out. Part of that is through education and certification of professionals. You're going to be looking for people who have CTSs, CTSDs, and CTSIs, who are people that have been trained, and we make sure that they're up on all the latest ideas. For instance, this whole project, they're going to be educated on this. They're going to be trained on what we're talking about, so people that come and help you design your buildings, your technology part, at least you know that they're aware of all of the latest standards and so forth. And we collaborate with a lot of other associations, too, to get all of this done. So the task force, we've already talked a lot about what that is, but the whole idea is that we try to get together industry subject matter experts and really brain trusts that can think about all these issues in very unique ways, and this is a great example of one of them. We have others as well. So I'm going to leave you with one crazy idea, and here's where the world is going, and there are already some market segments that are already well along the way to doing this. So imagine our world of the future where your building has been designed with building information modeling, BIM. Maybe as a show of hands, anybody ever even heard of BIM? Goodness, okay. Jay, our architect, is listening. Jay, no one raised their hand. So, so that's a little bit of a surprise to me. But anyway, so the buildings now are being developed, but they're not just drawings. There's metadata about every single little thing that's in the building. And we've been working on getting audiovisual metadata into the BIM structure, very successful at that, so that when you're finished building the building, you have this incredible amount of data, not just about the materials in it, but things like how to maintain it, how to clean it, what is ideas like the sustainability, the cradle-to-cradle aspects of the materials and so forth. All of this is part of this BIM model, and now that data can be used for analyzing across an entire community. What goes on in that building? What are we going to need to do in the future? What might happen in the future because of the cultural changes? So things like community colleges in some states, they already know this. They know what to build because they know who the people are that live there. They know who the companies are that are there. So they know what the topics might be that they have to teach, where the schools have to be built, and so forth. So this is where we're headed, and it's very sophisticated. And AV is really at the core of a lot of these ideas. So I just want you to be aware of that as we go. So anyway, that's all I have. So our little plug here is that we actually have 4 audiovisual standards right now, and we're working on quite a few more. So we have audio coverage uniformity. We want to make sure that everybody hears the same thing in a room, totally applicable to a courtroom. We have contrast ratio for projection systems. We want to make sure that we get that right so that everybody can see it. We're working on image size. We don't have that yet. We have documentation standards for project management, and we have one on energy management. So with that,
Well, and if I can just add to the reason that that's important for the courts, the Infocom standards, is now that those are available, I have built those into the 2011 California Trial Court Facility Standards, that it is a requirement from an AV systems perspective that you follow all of the Infocom standards. And the reason that that is so critical is going back to what we had talked about before in that picture, where you have a room such as this, where from an architectural perspective and from a courtroom, it's designed to be beautiful, but that can sometimes be the biggest nightmare for your AV system and your AV consultant as a court, by requiring that it follows the Infocom standards that the architects and the consultants, you now have a dialogue, you have a place for dialogue where there can be compromise, where they have to make sure that they're taking into consideration that from an audio coverage uniformity, that is now a standard that you as a court can hold on to if somebody ever challenges your cases or any of that based on the fact that they couldn't hear right. No, we followed the Infocom standards. These are standards, they've been uniform, they're adopted, they're ANSI certified. So it makes everything that you do defensible, as well as you're going to get the best type of system. So I just wanted to add that.
yeah, that's a really great idea. Okay, well, thank you. And now here's John.
I think is this one working?
Yes.
Oh, you have it. Okay. Right. Oops.
To have people speaking AV and IT. Well, we also need people speaking court speak from a legal perspective, from a judicial process perspective. And I want to just take a couple of minutes to remind you of some of those implications that have to go into the planning and operation of an AV, of a video processing. The key one is access to counsel. So typically when we have any kind of a criminal process that is going on with a remote defendant, we have to make sure that that defendant has access to defense counsel. And you can do that in multiple ways. The typical way is send the public defender to prison or to jail. They go over to the jail, they're there with their client during the arraignments. Now, it could be done differently, where the defense counsel interviews the defendant by video conference prior to the arraignment, establishes a lawyer-client relationship remotely, and gets the information needed to speak on behalf of the defendant at the time of the proceeding. But that's typically not the way it's done. Defense counsel generally feel that they need that face-to-face contact to establish a meaningful and trusting lawyer-client relationship, which is critically important for the whole progress of the case. And then if you did it that separate way, you would still have to have some sort of a separate communication channel so that the defense counsel could contact and talk to the defendant during the proceeding itself if something were to come up. If the prosecutor were to make an offer that hadn't been on the table, something like that. Now, when you separate, you put the public defender in jail and have the prosecutor in the courtroom, they cannot be negotiating over the plea during that proceeding. And that's a big loss to the process, because you all know that 95 to 99% of criminal cases are resolved by plea, not by trial. And the quicker we can get that plea, the better for the process. Another whole consideration is access to language interpretation. How are you going to provide the interpreter and link the interpreter into this process? there was one demonstration at this conference of remote interpretation, and that's now, I think, quite well figured out, where you have you have multiple access points for the interpreter. The interpreter goes into the courtroom and into the defendant. And one interesting thing to think about is American Sign Language, and that may actually be facilitated by a video link. One just little glancing comment. In California, they've done some research on different modes of interpretation and how the monolingual defendant feels. And it turns out that our gold standard is not their gold standard. The simultaneous interpretation, which is what we really want, is not what makes them feel most comfortable, because many of them do have some English. And so they are getting something from the judge's initial statement, but not all of it. But when they're getting the simultaneous input from the interpreter and from the judge at the same time, they can't take any advantage of what they would be able to hear from the judge. And they also feel that that whole process leaves them out. There's never any sound gap where they could say anything, because when the judge pauses, the interpreter doesn't pause. When the interpreter pauses, the judge is going. So there's no way to get in. Interesting. I just never thought of those implications of the interpretation process. And the other thing I just want to raise with you is how are we going to assess this Cook County issue in the future with this technology and other technologies? And the real issue is to what extent do we measure the outcomes of the new technology against the current face-to-face process? And what I want to just raise in our minds is that assumes that the current face-to-face process is perfect, and that any change to that is inferior. And there are lots of problems with that. Just think about all of those death penalty cases that have been reversed based on the DNA, and the scientific evidence that shows that the eyewitness identification it's not inherently unreliable, but it is highly imperfect. And you may be familiar with New Jersey adopting a comprehensive set of guidelines for what the judge is to tell the jury about the unreliability of eyewitness identification. There was another study by the National Science Foundation on all of our forensic tools, ballistics testing, fingerprinting, hair follicle analysis, and showing that the technologies behind them are nowhere near what television would lead us to believe. We even know that the DNA analysis process is not certainty. It is just high, very, very high probability. There's also a question about the extent to which anyone can assess credibility based on body language. And Anne will tell you that the research raises real questions with that, and in her interviews with Australian judges, about half of them said, well, when I started on the bench, I really thought I could tell just by listening to someone whether he or she was lying or not. But I now know that that's impossible. And the other half said, well, it's critically important to my decision making. So there are big issues going forward as to how it is that we will evaluate the legality of these processes. We have 2 minutes for questions, and any of us would be glad to answer them.
Yes. And we started late as well, so feel free, we'll be here. We'll stick around if there's questions, but does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
I'm going to put our friends back up. Emma and Jay, if you would turn your cameras back up, that would be good.
No questions, concerns? What did you, anything useful that you walk away from or go back and evaluate? One of the things that we didn't talk about for courts to think about is social technologies and how is that going to play into your courthouse now that you have Twitter, now that you have Facebook, now that you have all of these different things. We've already seen courts where cases, again, what is the legality of a juror tweeting? Do you require that people take away their phones? Even for your judicial officers, how are they responding to the cases when people are bringing in a divorce trial their Facebook pages to show that their spouse was cheating on them? So I'm not just thinking about like AV technology and things like that, but how is technology actually making its way into your proceedings? I think is really critical. 3D technology and software, demonstrative evidence, thinking and getting your judicial officers to think about that and how you run your courts and things like that. How is this 3D technology going to start being utilized as evidence? Those are those types of things for the courts to consider. Thank everybody for being here. So we'll be around. If you have any questions.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay and Emma.